A Sinister Tale from Alabama. Between 1923 and 1947, the Hargrave Institute for Moral Development in Mobile, Alabama claimed to rehabilitate over 800 troubled youth, yet only 340 ever returned home. The red brick building stood like a fortress against the Alabama sky, its Gothic windows reflecting nothing but darkness, even on the brightest summer days. Parents from across the Deep South sent their difficult children to what they believed was a beacon of Christian discipline and moral reformation. The Hargrave Institute promised transformation through faith, education, and hard work. What families didn't know was that behind those imposing walls, a systematic program of psychological experimentation, physical brutality, and calculated elimination had been operating under the guise of moral guidance for nearly 3 decades. The children who never came home weren't runaways or tragic accidents. They were casualties of America's most carefully concealed institutional horror. The institution's reputation. The Hargrave Institute for Moral Development opened its doors in Mobile, Alabama, on September 15, 1923, amid great fanfare and community celebration. Founded by Dr. Cornelius Hargrave, a prominent psychiatrist and Methodist minister, the institution was hailed as a revolutionary approach to juvenile rehabilitation. Local newspapers proclaimed it the South's answer to wayward youth, and prominent families from across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia eagerly enrolled their troubled children in what appeared to be a perfect blend of Christian values and modern psychological treatment. Dr. Hargrave himself was a figure of considerable respect in Mobile society. Born in 1885 to a wealthy cotton merchant family, he had studied psychology at Johns Hopkins University before obtaining his theological degree from Emory University. His published works on moral psychology and Christian behavioral modification had gained national attention, particularly his 1922 book, Reforming the Corrupted Soul, a scientific approach to Christian discipline. The book's central thesis, that moral corruption could be treated like a physical disease through controlled environmental conditioning, resonated with parents struggling with rebellious adolescents in the post-World War I era. The Institute's physical structure reflected its ambitious goals. The main building, constructed at a cost of $400,000, featured imposing Gothic Revival architecture, with thick stone walls, narrow windows, and elaborate ironwork. The facility included dormitories for 200 residents, classrooms, workshops, a chapel, medical facilities, and what Dr. Hargrave called specialized treatment rooms in the basement level. The grounds encompassed 150 acres of Alabama countryside, surrounded by a 10-foot brick wall that ostensibly protected the children from outside corrupting influences. The institution's reputation was carefully cultivated through strategic public relations efforts. Dr. Hargrave regularly hosted community leaders, church officials, and potential donors for tours of the facility's public areas. Visitors saw well-dressed, polite children engaged in educational activities, religious study, and vocational training. The Institute's choir performed at local churches, and select students gave testimonials about their moral transformation at community events. Local newspapers regularly published glowing reports about the Institute's success rates and innovative methods. The enrollment process was deliberately exclusive and expensive, which paradoxically enhanced the Institute's prestige. Annual tuition cost $1,200, equivalent to approximately $18,000 today, placing it beyond the reach of most families, but making it highly desirable among the wealthy elite who could afford such an investment in their children's moral development. Parents were required to sign extensive legal documents transferring complete guardianship rights to the Institute for the duration of their child's stay, typically ranging from 1 to 3 years. Dr. Hargrave's medical and religious credentials provided an aura of scientific legitimacy to the Institute's methods. His staff included licensed physicians, certified teachers, and ordained ministers, all carefully selected for their commitment to his theories of moral rehabilitation. The Institute claimed to use the latest advances in psychological science combined with time-tested Christian principles to address various behavioral problems including defiance, promiscuity, theft, lying, and what was then termed unnatural moral inclinations. The success stories promoted by the Institute were compelling and well documented in their public materials. Parents received detailed progress reports describing their children's spiritual growth, academic improvement, and behavioral transformation. Graduates who returned home often appeared genuinely changed, more subdued, respectful, and compliant with parental authority. These visible transformations convinced many families that Dr. Hargrave had indeed discovered an effective method for rehabilitating troubled youth. The Institute's influence extended beyond its immediate community. Dr. Hargrave served on several state educational committees and frequently consulted with other juvenile facilities across the South. His methods were studied and partially implemented at similar institutions in Tennessee, South Carolina, and Florida. Professional journals published his research on behavioral modification techniques, and he was invited to speak at national conferences on juvenile delinquency and moral education. Religious endorsement provided another crucial element of the Institute's reputation. The Alabama Methodist Conference officially endorsed the facility in 1925, and prominent ministers from various denominations served on its board of directors. The Institute's chapel services were reportedly so inspiring that some local families attended as guests, further reinforcing its image as a spiritually authentic institution. Financial records from the period show that the Institute operated profitably from its second year onward, with waiting lists for admission often extending 6 months or more. Wealthy families from as far away as Texas and Virginia sent their children to Mobile, attracted by the Institute's reputation for discretion and effectiveness. The facility's exclusivity became part of its appeal. Parents felt they were providing their troubled children with the finest available care, rather than simply warehousing them in a conventional reform school. The Institute's academic program was another source of community pride. Students reportedly achieved high scores on standardized tests, and many graduates went on to attend prestigious universities. The vocational training program taught valuable skills in carpentry, agriculture, and domestic arts, preparing students for productive adult lives. These tangible outcomes provided concrete evidence of the Institute's effectiveness that satisfied both parents and community observers. Dr. Hargrave's personal charisma and apparent devotion to his work further enhanced the institution's reputation. He lived on the grounds with his wife and 2 daughters, seemingly dedicating his entire life to the moral rehabilitation of troubled youth. His personal sacrifice and commitment impressed parents and community members alike, creating an atmosphere of trust and admiration that would prove crucial in maintaining the Institute's dark secrets for nearly 3 decades. The Institute's board of directors read like a who's who of Alabama society. Prominent businessman William Harris, owner of Harris Cotton Mills, served as chairman from 1924 until his death in 1939. Robert Anderson, president of Mobile First National Bank, provided financial oversight and frequently vouched for the Institute's fiscal responsibility to potential donors. Judge Thomas Lambert of the Mobile County Circuit Court served as legal counsel and helped navigate various regulatory requirements that might have otherwise posed obstacles to the Institute's operations. These influential board members did more than simply provide legitimacy. They actively protected the Institute from scrutiny. When occasional complaints arose about the facility's methods or student outcomes, board members used their connections to ensure that investigations were either perfunctory or never initiated at all. Judge Lambert's position was particularly valuable, as he could influence court proceedings and ensure that legal challenges to the Institute were dismissed on technical grounds. The Institute's integration into Mobile's social fabric extended to its role in charitable and civic activities. The facility regularly hosted fundraising events for local causes, with students performing musical and dramatic presentations that showcased their apparent moral transformation. These events served dual purposes. They generated positive publicity for the Institute while providing opportunities for Dr. Hargrave and his staff to cultivate relationships with potential donors and political allies. The Institute's apparent success attracted attention from academic and professional circles beyond Alabama. Dr. Hargrave published regular articles in journals such as the American Journal of Psychology and the Christian Educator, detailing his innovative approaches to juvenile rehabilitation. These publications enhanced his professional reputation and drew visitors from universities and government agencies interested in studying his methods. By 1930, the Hargrave Institute had become a model that other states sought to emulate. Delegations from juvenile facilities in Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina made regular visits to observe the Institute's operations and learn from Dr. Hargrave's expertise. Several states appropriated funds to establish similar institutions based on the Hargrave model, further cementing Dr. Hargrave's reputation as a pioneer in the field of moral rehabilitation. The Institute's success was measured not only by the apparent transformation of its students, but also by its financial stability and growth. By 1935, the facility had expanded to include additional dormitories, workshops, and recreational facilities. The expansion was funded through a combination of tuition revenue, private donations, and state subsidies, reflecting the broad support the Institute enjoyed from multiple sources. Perhaps most importantly, the Institute had created what appeared to be a self-perpetuating cycle of success. Graduates who had been successfully rehabilitated often returned to visit, sharing testimonials about how the Institute had changed their lives. Some even sent their own children to the facility when they encountered behavioral problems, creating a multi-generational pattern of trust and loyalty that seemed to validate the Institute's methods. The careful construction of this reputation, built over more than a decade of strategic relationship building and public relations efforts, would ultimately serve as the perfect camouflage for one of America's most systematic and prolonged programs of institutional abuse, psychological experimentation, and calculated elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The very success of the Institute's public image would make it almost impossible for outsiders to believe that such a respected institution could harbor such dark secrets. Ignored signs. The first documented concerns about the Hargrave Institute emerged as early as 1925, just 2 years after its founding, but these early warnings were systematically dismissed or suppressed by local authorities who had become financially and politically invested in the institution's success. The pattern of ignored signs would for over 2 decades, creating an environment where increasingly brazen abuses could occur without meaningful investigation or intervention. Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, a seamstress from Birmingham, was among the first parents to raise serious questions about the Institute's methods. Her 15-year-old son, William, had been enrolled in September 1924 for what his father described as excessive defiance and moral corruption. After 6 months without any communication from William, despite Institute policies promising monthly letters, Mrs. Hughes demanded to visit her son. When she finally gained access to the facility in March 1925, she found William dramatically changed, 20 pounds thinner, speaking in barely audible whispers, and exhibiting what she described as a constant, nervous tremor in his hands. Mrs. Hughes immediately withdrew William from the Institute and attempted to file complaints with both local police and state education authorities. Her concerns were documented in a letter to the Mobile County Sheriff's Department dated March 18, 1925. My son appears to have been subjected to treatments that have fundamentally altered his personality and physical health. He refuses to discuss his experiences at the Institute, but suffers from severe nightmares and exhibits signs of profound psychological trauma. The sheriff's response, filed 2 weeks later, dismissed her concerns as the typical anxieties of an overprotective mother, and noted that Dr. Hargrave's methods were approved by medical and religious authorities. Similar complaints began accumulating throughout 1925 and 1926, but they followed a consistent pattern of official dismissal. The parents who complained were typically characterized as difficult or unwilling to accept their children's necessary discipline. Local newspaper coverage of these complaints was minimal and generally favorable to the Institute, often featuring quotes from Dr. Hargrave explaining that, Some parents struggle to accept the profound but necessary changes required for true moral rehabilitation. More disturbing were the reports of children who never returned home at all. Institute records indicated that approximately 15% of enrolled students transferred to specialized facilities better suited to their particular needs, or returned to distant relatives for continued care. However, efforts by families to locate these transferred children consistently met with bureaucratic obstacles and contradictory information. The case of 16-year-old Helen Brooks became particularly troubling for families monitoring the Institute's operations. Helen had been enrolled in January 1926 for what her parents described as unacceptable romantic associations with unsuitable young men. In July 1926, her parents received a formal letter from Dr. Hargrave stating that Helen had been transferred to a specialized facility in Tennessee where her particular moral challenges could be more appropriately addressed. When Helen's father, John Thompson, traveled to Tennessee to locate the supposed facility, he discovered that no such institution existed at the address provided. Thompson's subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of false documentation and fabricated transfers that affected at least 12 families over the Institute's first 3 years of operation. His findings were compiled into a formal complaint filed with the Alabama State Attorney General's office in September 1926. The complaint documented numerous inconsistencies in Institute records, unexplained student disappearances, and what Thompson characterized as a systematic program of deception regarding the fate of children entrusted to Dr. Hargrave's care. The Attorney General's response was swift, but not in the direction Thompson had hoped. Rather than launching an investigation into the Institute, the state instead initiated an investigation into Thompson's business practices and personal finances. Within 6 months, Thompson's small manufacturing company faced sudden tax audits, regulatory challenges, and the unexplained cancellation of major contracts. Thompson later told associates that he believed his investigation into the Institute had triggered a campaign of economic retaliation designed to silence his complaints. Another significant warning sign emerged from the Institute's own staff turnover patterns. Between 1926 and 1929, the facility experienced an unusually high rate of employee resignations, particularly among younger staff members who worked directly with the children. Exit interviews, when they occurred at all, typically cited philosophical differences with treatment methodologies, or personal family obligations requiring relocation. However, a more detailed picture emerged from a confidential letter written by former Institute teacher Margaret Wells to her sister in 1928. The letter, which would not surface until decades later, described treatment methods that violate every principle of Christian charity and human decency. Wells wrote, "The children live in constant terror of being selected for what Dr. Hargrave calls intensive rehabilitation sessions in the basement facilities. Those who return from these sessions are fundamentally changed, not reformed, but broken. Some never return at all, and we are told they have been transferred to other facilities, but I have never seen any documentation of these transfers." Wells's letter also described a culture of fear among the staff. "We are all required to sign agreements promising complete confidentiality about treatment methods and student outcomes. Staff members who ask too many questions about missing children or unusual treatment procedures are quickly dismissed and threatened with legal action if they discuss their concerns publicly." Dr. Hargrave maintains extensive files on all employees, including information about their personal lives and financial situations, that he claims is necessary for security purposes, but which clearly serves to ensure our silence. The most chilling ignored sign was the pattern of accidental deaths that began occurring at the Institute around 1927. Official records indicated that approximately 1 student per year died from various causes: drowning in the facility's pond, falls from buildings during escape attempts, and medical emergencies related to pre-existing conditions. Each death was investigated by local coroner James Franklin, who consistently ruled them accidental or due to natural causes. However, the families of deceased children began to notice suspicious patterns in these deaths. The children who died were typically those who had been most resistant to the Institute's discipline, most vocal about wanting to return home, or most likely to cause trouble if released back into the community. Additionally, families were consistently denied access to their children's bodies for independent autopsies, with Dr. Hargrave citing health regulations that required immediate burial of infectious disease victims. The case of 17-year-old Charles Baker exemplified this troubling pattern. Baker had been enrolled in 1928 for persistent criminal behavior, including theft and assault. According to his sister's later testimony, Charles had managed to smuggle out a letter in December 1928 describing horrific treatment, including prolonged isolation, forced medical procedures, and what he called experiments on children who never come back. 3 weeks after this letter was received, the family was notified that Charles had drowned while attempting to escape across the facility's pond. When Charles's father demanded to see his son's body, he was told that immediate burial had been necessary due to severe decomposition caused by prolonged submersion. The family was presented with a sealed coffin and told that opening it would pose serious health risks. However, Charles' sister noted that the coffin seemed unusually light for a 17-year-old boy, and the funeral director appeared nervous and evasive when questioned about the burial procedures. By 1930, a network of concerned families had begun sharing information about their experiences with the Institute. This informal group, led by parents who had successfully withdrawn their children or who were seeking missing family members, documented a pattern of abuse, disappearances, and cover-ups that painted a disturbing picture of systematic criminal activity operating under the guise of moral rehabilitation. The network's most significant discovery came when they compared the Institute's official enrollment records with death certificates and transfer documentation. Their analysis revealed that over 120 children who had been enrolled at the Institute between 1923 and 1930 could not be accounted for through legitimate means. The Institute claimed these children had been transferred to other facilities or returned to distant relatives, but the family's investigations found no evidence to support these claims. Several families hired private investigators to trace the whereabouts of their missing children. These investigations consistently met with obstacles that suggested coordination between the Institute and local authorities. Private investigators reported being followed, threatened, and in some cases arrested on fabricated charges when they attempted to examine Institute records or interview former employees. The most persistent investigator was Frank Reynolds, a former police detective from Birmingham, whose nephew had disappeared from the Institute in 1929. Reynolds' investigation uncovered evidence of financial irregularities in the Institute's operations, including payments to local officials that appeared to be bribes for protection from scrutiny. His detailed reports documented a web of corruption that extended from the Institute to the Sheriff's Department, the Coroner's Office, and several local judges. Reynolds' investigation was abruptly terminated in August 1931 when he was found severely beaten outside his Birmingham office. Though he survived the attack, Reynolds suffered permanent brain damage that ended his investigative career. The assault was never solved, and Reynolds' files relating to the Hargrave Institute mysteriously disappeared from his office during the attack. Now, despite accumulating evidence of serious problems at the Institute, local and state authorities continued to dismiss or actively suppress complaints. The Institute's financial contributions to local political campaigns, its prestigious board of directors, and Dr. Hargrave's professional reputation created a protective barrier that would shield the facility's darkest secrets for another decade and a half. The systematic suppression of evidence reached its most sophisticated level with the creation of what Dr. Hargrave called the Alumni Relations Program in 1932. This program ostensibly tracked the progress of former students and maintained contact with their families to document long-term success rates. In reality, the program served as an early warning system to identify families who might be developing suspicions about the Institute's operations. Families who showed signs of skepticism or who asked too many questions about missing children were subjected to various forms of harassment and intimidation. Their mail was intercepted, their phone calls monitored, and their business and personal relationships sabotaged through carefully orchestrated whisper campaigns. The program was so effective that by 1935, complaints about the Institute had virtually ceased, not because problems had been resolved, but because potential complainants had been effectively silenced. The final element in the Institute's protective strategy was the cultivation of relationships with state and federal officials who might otherwise pose a threat to the facility's operations. Dr. Hargrave regularly hosted politicians and government officials at the Institute, showcasing its apparent success and building personal relationships that would prove invaluable when official scrutiny threatened to expose the institution's crimes. These relationships were cemented through a combination of political contributions, personal favors, and what Dr. Hargrave euphemistically called consulting arrangements that provided government officials with financial incentives to protect the Institute's interests. By 1940, the Institute had created such a comprehensive network of protection that it operated with virtual impunity, confident that its crimes would never be exposed or prosecuted. Horror uncovered. The systematic exposure of the Hargrave Institute's true nature began in the summer of 1942, when a maintenance worker named Robert Anderson made a discovery that would finally crack the institution's carefully constructed facade. Anderson, who had been employed at the facility for only 3 months, was tasked with repairing a damaged steam pipe in the building's sub-basement, an area that had been declared off-limits to most staff members for safety reasons related to the building's heating and electrical systems. While excavating around the pipe, Anderson uncovered what appeared to be a small section of concrete flooring that had been recently poured and improperly cured. Beneath this thin concrete layer, he discovered human remains, specifically the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a young person, wrapped in what had once been institutional clothing. Terrified by his discovery, Anderson initially said nothing, but over the following weeks he began to notice other areas of the sub-basement where the flooring appeared to have been recently disturbed. Anderson's decision to come forward was ultimately prompted by his recognition of a piece of jewelry found with the remains, a distinctive class ring from Mobile High School, class of 1932. Through careful inquiry, he learned that the ring matched the description of one worn by Edward Collins, a 16-year-old who had allegedly been transferred to a facility in Georgia in 1933. Anderson contacted Collins's family directly, bypassing local authorities whom he suspected might suppress his findings. The Collins family, who had spent nearly a decade searching for their son, immediately demanded a thorough investigation of the Institute's premises. However, their initial attempts to involve local law enforcement met with familiar resistance. Mobile County Sheriff Walter Green claimed that Anderson's discovery was likely related to historical burials from the property's previous use, and that disturbing what might be a legitimate cemetery would require extensive legal procedures. Frustrated by local authorities' inaction, the Collins family contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation, claiming that the disappearance of children from multiple states constituted a federal crime requiring federal investigation. FBI agent George Mitchell was assigned to conduct a preliminary inquiry into the allegations against the Hargrave Institute in September 1942. Mitchell's initial investigation immediately uncovered serious discrepancies in the Institute's records. Of the 847 children officially enrolled between 1923 and 1942, only 623 could be accounted for through documented releases, transfers, or deaths. The remaining 224 children had simply vanished from the records, with no forwarding addresses, transfer documentation, or death certificates. When Mitchell demanded access to these missing records, Dr. Hargrave claimed that they had been destroyed in a fire that damaged the administrative building in 1938, a fire that local authorities had no record of investigating. More disturbing were the medical records that did survive. Mitchell discovered that the Institute had been conducting unauthorized medical procedures on enrolled children, including experimental surgeries, drug trials, and what were euphemistically described as advanced psychological interventions. These procedures were performed without parental consent and often without any medical justification beyond Dr. Hargrave's theories about physical manifestations of moral corruption. The breakthrough in Mitchell's investigation came when he located 3 former institute employees who had been dismissed for policy violations but were willing to testify about their experiences. Marie Douglas, a former nurse who had worked at the facility from 1935 to 1937, provided the most damaging testimony about the Institute's actual operations. According to Douglas's sworn statement, the Institute operated what Dr. Hargrave called graduated rehabilitation protocols that bore no resemblance to conventional educational or psychological treatment. Children who failed to respond to initial discipline were subjected to increasingly severe interventions, including prolonged isolation, forced medical procedures, and psychological torture designed to completely break their resistance to authority. Douglas described a systematic program of human experimentation that had been operating since the Institute's earliest years. Children were selected for various research projects based on their perceived intelligence, physical health, and likelihood of being missed by their families. These experiments included testing of experimental drugs, surgical procedures intended to modify behavior through brain surgery, and psychological conditioning techniques that often resulted in permanent mental damage. The most horrifying aspect of Douglas's testimony concerned what happened to children who failed to respond to these experimental treatments or who posed ongoing risks to the Institute's security. These children were subjected to what Dr. Hargrave termed final rehabilitation, a euphemism for systematic murder designed to eliminate potential witnesses to the Institute's crimes. Douglas's testimony was corroborated by 2 other former employees, maintenance supervisor Joseph Carter and kitchen worker Francis Lowe. Carter provided detailed descriptions of the sub-basement facilities, including specially constructed rooms designed for medical procedures, isolation chambers, and what he believed to be a crematorium used to dispose of human remains. Lowe testified about the systematic malnutrition and poisoning of selected children, often disguised as treatment for various medical conditions. Based on this testimony and his own investigation, Agent Mitchell obtained federal warrants to conduct a comprehensive search of the Institute's premises in November 1942. The search revealed physical evidence that confirmed the witnesses' most horrific allegations. The sub-basement contained extensive facilities for medical experimentation, including surgical equipment, drug storage areas, and detailed records of procedures performed on hundreds of children over nearly 2 decades. Most damning were the detailed records Dr. Hargrave had maintained of his experimental programs. These documents, discovered in a hidden safe behind his office bookshelf, contained meticulous documentation of medical procedures, psychological experiments, and elimination protocols that revealed the systematic nature of the Institute's crimes. The records included photographs, detailed procedure notes, and follow-up assessments that treated the children as nothing more than laboratory specimens. The excavation of the Institute's grounds, conducted over several weeks in late 1942, uncovered the remains of 89 children buried in unmarked graves throughout the property. Forensic examination revealed that many had died from surgical procedures, drug overdoses, or deliberate poisoning. Others showed evidence of severe physical trauma consistent with torture or deliberate injury. Perhaps most disturbing were the detailed psychological profiles Dr. Hargrave had compiled on each victim, describing their resistance to treatment, potential threat to the Institute's security, and ultimate decision to terminate their rehabilitation process. These clinical descriptions of child murder, written in the dispassionate language of medical research, revealed the calculated and systematic nature of the Institute's crimes. The investigation also uncovered extensive documentation of Dr. Hargrave's connections to other similar facilities across the South, suggesting that the Hargrave Institute was part of a larger network of institutions conducting unauthorized human experimentation under the guise of juvenile rehabilitation. Letters and financial records revealed coordination with facilities in Tennessee, South Carolina, and Florida, including the exchange of children for various experimental programs. Agent Mitchell's investigation revealed that Dr. Hargrave had been conducting what he called longitudinal studies on human behavioral modification since 1925. These studies involved deliberately traumatizing children through various means and then documenting their psychological and physical responses over extended periods. The studies were designed to test theories about breaking human resistance to authority and creating completely compliant personalities. The most disturbing discovery was a series of documents Dr. Hargrave had titled the Hargrave Protocols, which outlined systematic methods for psychological and physical torture designed to achieve what he called total personality reconstruction. These protocols included detailed instructions for sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, nutritional manipulation, chemical interventions, and surgical procedures that amounted to deliberate brain damage. The protocols were organized into 5 progressive stages, with each stage designed to break down specific aspects of a child's personality and resistance. Stage 1 involved isolation and sensory deprivation, designed to create complete dependence on their captors. Stage 2 introduced physical and psychological torture, designed to eliminate any sense of personal autonomy. Stage 3 involved chemical and surgical interventions, designed to permanently alter brain function. Stage 4 tested the effectiveness of the modifications through increasingly severe challenges to compliance. Stage 5 was designated as final resolution for subjects who failed to achieve complete compliance, a euphemism for murder. Mitchell's investigation revealed that Dr. Hargrave had been corresponding with similar researchers in Germany, exchanging information about human experimentation techniques and results. These letters, dating from 1926 through 1941, suggested that the Hargrave Institute was part of an international network of researchers conducting unauthorized human experiments on vulnerable populations. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Dr. Hargrave had been selling children to other research facilities and private collectors who were interested in acquiring subjects for their own experimental programs. Financial records showed payments from various sources for what were euphemistically described as specialized placements that bore no resemblance to legitimate educational or medical transfers. By December 1942, federal investigators had compiled evidence of systematic murder, human experimentation, fraud, conspiracy, and human trafficking involving not only Dr. Hargrave, but also several staff members, local officials, and board members who had enabled and covered up the Institute's crimes for nearly 2 decades. The scope and systematic nature of these crimes represented one of the most extensive cases of institutional child abuse in American history. However, the full extent of the Hargrave Institute's crimes would never be completely revealed, as key evidence and witnesses would mysteriously disappear before the case could come to trial, ensuring that many of the institution's darkest secrets would remain buried forever. The investigation had uncovered only a fraction of the horrors that had occurred within the Institute's walls, and much of what had been discovered would soon be classified and sealed away from public scrutiny. The final weeks of the investigation revealed that the Institute's crimes extended far beyond the facility itself. Dr. Hargrave had been operating a network of affiliated institutions across the South, all using similar methods and sharing resources, including the transfer of children between facilities for various experimental purposes. This network represented a coordinated program of human experimentation and elimination that had claimed hundreds of victims over nearly 2 decades. Legacy and silence. The arrest of Dr. Cornelius Hargrave and 12 associates in December 1942 should have marked the beginning of justice for the 89 identified victims and their families. Instead, it initiated one of the most comprehensive and systematic cover-ups in American legal history, orchestrated by powerful interests who had too much to lose if the full extent of the Institute's connections were revealed to the public. The first indication that the case would not proceed to a normal prosecution came in January 1943, when FBI agent George Mitchell was abruptly reassigned to urgent national security matters related to the war effort. Mitchell's replacement, Agent Harold Price, arrived with explicit instructions to streamline the investigation to focus on the most serious charges while avoiding unnecessary complications that might compromise ongoing war-related operations. Rice's first action was to classify large portions of the evidence as sensitive to national security, making them inaccessible to defense attorneys, victims' families, and eventually even prosecutors. The justification was that Dr. Hargrave's experimental procedures had potential applications to military interrogation and psychological warfare techniques, making public disclosure potentially harmful to the war effort. This classification effectively sealed the most damaging evidence against not only Hargrave, but also his network of associates at other institutions. Simultaneously, key witnesses began experiencing severe pressure to modify or withdraw their testimony. Marie Douglas, the former nurse whose testimony had been crucial in exposing the Institute's crimes, received a series of increasingly threatening phone calls in February 1943. When these failed to silence her, she was arrested on fabricated charges of theft from her current employer. Although the charges were eventually dropped, the message was clear: cooperation with the prosecution would result in personal destruction. Joseph Carter, the maintenance supervisor who had corroborated Douglas's testimony, simply disappeared in March 1943. His family reported him missing to local police, who claimed he had likely relocated for war work and declined to investigate further. Carter's body was discovered 3 months later in a remote area outside Mobile, officially ruled a suicide despite evidence of severe trauma inconsistent with self-inflicted injury. The systematic elimination of witnesses reached its most brazen point with the death of Robert Anderson, the maintenance worker whose discovery had initiated the entire investigation. Anderson was found dead in his apartment in April 1943, apparently from carbon monoxide poisoning caused by a faulty heating system. However, the apartment's heating had been electric, and the carbon monoxide levels were consistent with deliberate poisoning rather than accidental exposure. With key witnesses dead, intimidated, or legally prevented from testifying, the prosecution's case began to crumble. Dr. Hargrave's defense team, led by prominent attorneys with connections to several governors and senators, successfully argued that much of the evidence had been improperly obtained and that the federal government lacked jurisdiction over what they characterized as local educational matters. The breakthrough for the defense came in June 1943 when they revealed that several of Dr. Hargrave's experimental procedures had been conducted under contract with various government agencies, including the Office of Strategic Services and the Department of War. These contracts, they argued, provided legal authorization for procedures that might otherwise appear questionable, and prosecution of Dr. Hargrave would effectively criminalize legitimate government research. This revelation forced federal prosecutors into an impossible position. Pursuing the case would require disclosure of classified government programs that authorized human experimentation, potentially exposing other similar operations and embarrassing powerful officials. Dropping the case would allow documented child murderers to escape justice. The compromise reached in August 1943 satisfied no one but served the interests of those seeking to minimize public exposure. Dr. Hargrave and his associates were allowed to plead guilty to reduced charges of negligent endangerment of minors and improper medical procedures. Hargrave received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, while his associates received sentences ranging from 2 to 6 years. The plea agreement included provisions sealing all records related to government contracts and experimental procedures, effectively ensuring that the full scope of the Institute's crimes would never be publicly revealed. Even these minimal sentences were not actually served. Dr. Hargrave was quietly released after serving only 4 years, officially for health reasons, but actually as part of a classified agreement to provide consultation services to government psychological warfare programs. His associates were similarly released early and relocated to new identities in other states. their records expunged, and their involvement in the Institute's crimes effectively erased from official documentation. The families of victims found themselves facing a legal system designed to frustrate their search for justice and accountability. Wrongful death lawsuits were blocked by claims of government immunity and national security concerns. Requests for information about their children's fate were denied under various classifications and privacy protections. Even basic death certificates for identified victims were withheld, preventing families from achieving legal closure. The cover-up extended to the physical evidence of the Institute's crimes. The building itself was demolished in 1944, officially for public health reasons, but actually to eliminate physical evidence of the experimental facilities. The victims' remains were reburied in unmarked graves at various locations, making future investigation impossible. All medical equipment, records, and research materials were either destroyed or transferred to classified government storage facilities. Local records relating to the Institute were systematically purged from public archives, newspaper files, and government documents. The Mobile County Sheriff's Department claimed that their files related to the case had been damaged by water and subsequently destroyed. The county courthouse reported that civil records relating to the Institute had been lost during routine archive maintenance. Even church records mentioning the Institute or its board members were mysteriously purged from various archives. The survivors of the Institute faced a different kind of horror, systematic intimidation and persecution designed to ensure their permanent silence about their experiences. Those who had been released before the investigation were contacted by men claiming to be federal agents, who informed them that discussing their experiences would constitute disclosure of classified information subject to prosecution for treason. Several survivors who attempted to tell their stories publicly met with suspicious accidents or sudden illnesses. Ruth Palmer, who had survived 3 years at the Institute and attempted to testify before a congressional committee in 1945, was found dead in her apartment 2 days before her scheduled testimony. The death was ruled a suicide, despite the absence of any evidence of suicidal intent and the presence of injuries consistent with a struggle. By 1950, the Hargrave Institute had been effectively erased from public memory. Official histories of juvenile rehabilitation in Alabama made no mention of the facility. Educational journals that had previously praised Dr. Hargrave's methods were quietly revised to remove all references to his work. Professional associations purged their membership records and publications of any connection to the Institute or its staff. The few remaining survivors learned to live with their trauma in complete isolation, knowing that any attempt to seek justice or even acknowledgement of their suffering would result in retaliation. Some developed elaborate personal mythologies to explain their experiences, creating fictional versions of their childhoods that allowed them to function in society while keeping their true histories buried. The systematic destruction of evidence reached unprecedented levels of thoroughness. Government agents conducted raids on the homes and offices of anyone who had been connected to the investigation, confiscating documents, photographs, and personal correspondence that might reference the Institute. Libraries and newspaper archives were systematically purged of any materials that mentioned the facility or its operations. The cover-up extended to the academic and professional communities that had once celebrated Dr. Hargrave's work. Universities that had hosted his lectures removed all records of his visits from their archives. Professional journals that had published his research were recalled and reprinted with articles about other topics substituted for his contributions. Medical and psychological associations expunged all references to his membership and achievements from their historical records. Perhaps most disturbing was the fate of the Institute's surviving staff members who had not been directly implicated in the crimes. Many experienced mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses in the months following the investigation. Those who survived were relocated to distant states under new identities, with their employment records and personal histories completely fabricated to eliminate any connection to the Institute. The few staff members who attempted to maintain contact with each other or who showed signs of wanting to discuss their experiences publicly were subjected to continuous surveillance and harassment. Their mail was intercepted, their phone calls monitored, and their employment opportunities sabotaged until they learned to maintain absolute silence about their past. The elimination of institutional memory was so complete that by 1955, no active employee of any government agency in Alabama had any recollection of the Hargrave Institute's existence. New employees who might stumble across references to the facility in old files were told that these were records of a classified military training facility that had operated during the war, and that any discussion of the facility was prohibited under national security regulations. The families of victims found themselves facing not only legal obstacles, but also financial ruin designed to prevent them from pursuing independent investigations. Many experienced sudden business failures, inexplicable tax problems, and banking difficulties that forced them to focus on basic survival rather than seeking justice for their murdered children. Those families who persisted in their efforts to uncover the truth were subjected to more direct forms of intimidation. Several family members died in apparent accidents or suicides that effectively ended their families' investigations. The message was clear. Continuing to seek answers about the Institute would result in the destruction of entire family lines. The psychological impact on survivors and families was devastating and long-lasting. Many survivors developed severe mental health problems that were exacerbated by their inability to seek treatment that acknowledged their actual experiences. Mental health professionals who might have been willing to treat Institute survivors were warned that attempting to verify or validate their patients' accounts would result in the loss of their professional licenses. Families who had lost children to the Institute often disintegrated under the combined pressure of grief, guilt, and fear. Marriages ended in divorce, siblings became estranged, and extended family relationships were severed as people tried to protect themselves from the contamination of association with the Institute's victims. The ultimate success of the cover-up was demonstrated in 1975, when a historical society researcher, attempting to document juvenile institutions in Alabama, could find no official record that the Hargrave Institute had ever existed. Property records showed the land had been used for agricultural purposes throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Educational directories contained no listings for any institution by that name. Even genealogical records of the Hargrave family had been altered to remove any mention of Dr. Cornelius Hargrave's career in juvenile rehabilitation. The researcher's inquiry itself triggered a renewed round of surveillance and intimidation. Within weeks of beginning his research, he received threatening phone calls, his car was vandalized, and his employment at the university was terminated on fabricated charges of academic misconduct. The message was clear. Even 3 decades after the Institute's closure, any attempt to investigate its history would be met with swift and severe retaliation. By 1980, the cover-up had achieved its ultimate goal, the complete erasure of the Institute from collective memory. No survivors remained who were willing or able to tell their stories. No family members continued to seek answers about their missing children. No researchers or journalists dared to investigate the fragmentary evidence that occasionally surfaced. The few documents that escaped destruction were scattered across various classified archives, where they were buried under multiple layers of security classifications. Access to these documents required clearances that were virtually impossible to obtain, and even those few officials who had the necessary clearances were warned that accessing Institute-related materials would end their careers. Today, the former site of the Hargrave Institute is occupied by a modern shopping center. Shoppers park their cars over the unmarked graves of 89 children whose only crime was being inconvenient to their families and whose only mistake was trusting the adults who were supposed to protect them. The silence that was purchased with their lives continues to this day, a testament to the power of institutional authority to make inconvenient truths disappear. The shopping center's construction in 1978 required extensive excavation of the site, during which workers reportedly discovered additional human remains. However, these discoveries were never officially reported, and the workers who made them were quickly transferred to projects in other states. The construction continued without interruption, literally burying the final physical evidence of the Institute's crimes beneath tons of concrete and steel. The few remaining documents related to the case remain classified, scheduled for release in 2045, a full century after the Institute's closure. By then, all survivors, victims, families, and witnesses will be long dead, ensuring that the full truth about America's most systematic program of institutional child murder will die with them, leaving only whispers and fragments of a horror too vast and too shameful for a civilized society to acknowledge. Even this scheduled release date may prove meaningless, as the document's classification has been renewed multiple times under various national security justifications. Each renewal pushes the potential disclosure further into the future, making it increasingly likely that the truth about the Hargrave Institute will never be revealed to the American public. The legacy of the Institute's crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The successful cover-up established precedents for institutional secrecy and government protection of criminal enterprises that to influence American society today. The techniques developed to silence witnesses and destroy evidence have been refined and applied to other cases where institutional crimes threaten to embarrass powerful interests. Perhaps most tragically, the complete erasure of the Institute's history has prevented any meaningful effort to identify and protect other children who may have been victimized by similar institutions. The network of facilities that Dr. Hargrave had established continued to operate under different names and management, protected by the same powerful interests that had shielded the original institute from justice. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.